So we're back live and want to call the committee back to order. We have Rosie Kruger with us from the Department of Ed. And we're going to get a little update maybe in regards to the Universal School Meals Program that we over the last several years have spent quite a lot of time talking about and finally getting the Universal Meals Program set up last year. And it was set up for a 1-year period, and then we were going to get reviewed this session and try to get it. Some of us are trying to get it renewed, but we need to know, how it worked and how schools are managing their sign-ups and their getting their people to fill out their disclosure forms and all the knowledge that goes along with trying to get a bill reauthorized for this next year. So, Rosie, we have 3 new people, one brand new, Irene. So we'll introduce ourselves and go from there.
Brian Collmore from the Rutland District.
Irene Renner, Chittenden North, which includes Fairfax and Franklin County.
Brian Campion, Bennington County.
Rich West from Lamoille.
And Bobby Starr from Oregon. So, welcome and good to see you.
So thank you. For the record, I'm Rosie Kruger. I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. And I oversee a team of 8.5 folks who help me implement, we're the state agency that is responsible for implementing all of the federal child nutrition programs in the state of Vermont. And so we conduct all the oversight of those programs and pass through the funding to schools, child cares, nonprofit organizations around the state who are actually the ones providing the meals to children. So the Agency of Education has submitted the requested Universal Meals report, updating you on the implementation so far this year. So that's available on the reports section of the legislature's website. And then just yesterday, we submitted the local foods incentive report as well, which you might be interested in. That's not the topic today, but just giving you a heads up that has been submitted. And we shared that with Linda as well. So I didn't prepare extensive testimony today. I can kind of walk you through a little bit about what's in the report, but I'm really happy to kind of follow your lead in terms of what pieces of information you're specifically interested in. So I can kind of start with telling you a little bit about what we've done to implement universal meals this year and how it's gone so far. And then we can kind of go from there in terms of your questions.
Yeah.
So the agency did a lot of work over the summer months to prepare. Maybe I should start for the new members with kind of describing how CEP and Provision 2, which are the 2 federal options that we've used to provide universal meals. Those are 2 options that have long existed. Schools have the option to offer universal meals that way, but they require local funding. And so that was kind of the rub. And some schools in Vermont prior to COVID had been using those options to provide universal meals. But during COVID, the federal government provided funding for all the schools to provide meals at no charge to all students. And so then coming out of that, those federal waivers to allow that ended in June of 2022. That's when we started implementing this 1-year universal meals bill that the legislature passed last year. So that bill provides federal funding to cover the cost of what we call the paid student share of meals. So under the federal programs, we have 3 categories of meals: free, reduced, and paid. and the federal government reimburses those meals at a different rate for each category, as long as the meal meets the federal meal pattern requirements. So it has to have certain components to be considered a reimbursable meal. And so the free meals are reimbursed by the feds at the free reimbursement rate, which is meant to really cover the cost of the meal. The reduced meals are covered by the feds at that free rate minus 40 cents per lunch and 30 cents per breakfast, which is supposed to be covered by the student's family under the normal circumstances. But in Vermont, we have long paid for that at the state level. So those meals are still at no charge to those students, but we're drawing down a little less federal reimbursement. And then we have the paid meals, which still actually do draw down a little bit of federal funding. Those are still subsidized by the federal government, but those are not fully, it's just a little bit of federal funding, about 40 cents per meal. And then the remainder normally comes from the household. And so
what does a full meal cost? Does it vary much?
it varies. So it's just generally right now about $4.50 if you were to pay for that meal. The paid meals can't be subsidized by the free and reduced price meals. So the federal government sets a minimum price for the paid meals, and then the schools can charge more than that if they want. And again, this is not happening in Vermont public schools this year because the state's paying that difference. So Act 151, which is the Universal Meals Bill last year, that provides for state funding for the difference between that free reimbursement rate and that paid reimbursement rate if the school operates either the community eligibility provision or provision 2, which are these two federal options that allow us to draw down the most federal funds. Act 151 also requires that schools offer meals at no charge to all students this year. So theoretically, the school could choose to not operate one of those two options, but then they'd be missing out on the state funding. So all the schools wisely chose to operate those options, and we're drawing down the most federal funding we could be. So under the community eligibility provision, meals are reimbursed for, we look at the number of, let's go back to how a child might qualify for free or reduced price meals. If a household makes under 130% of the federal poverty level, they can apply for free and reduced price meals, or for free meals via an application showing their income. If they make under 185% of the federal poverty level for their household size, they can apply for reduced price meals via an application. So that's the group that qualifies via applications. And then there's this other group of students who could qualify for free meals via direct certification. And that's when they participate in another means tested program, such as 3 Squares Vermont. And so DCF kind of communicates to AOE every month the names of the children and households participating in 3 Squares Vermont, and reach out, and we then push that information down to the schools. They match those students, and those families don't have to submit an application. So households may qualify for meals in those variety of ways. Under the community eligibility provision, we don't collect applications at all. We just look at the number of kids who are directly certified for free meals, and we multiply that by a multiplier of 1.6. And that is the percent of meals that we're able to claim at the free reimbursement rate. And then the remainder of those meals are claimed at the paid reimbursement rate. And that's where that state funding is coming in for those CEP schools. For schools operating provision 2, you collect applications in the first year of a 5-year cycle, of a 4-year cycle. And in that first year, you count who eats, and you claim based on the status of the kids who eat, even though meals are served for free to all those students. But then in the subsequent years, you're not counting which students are eating, you're not collecting applications, you're just applying those claiming percentages established in that first year to the total number of meals that were served.
Can I just,
Yeah.
is 3 Squares a different poverty level than the first 2 programs, 185%?
So Three Squares is under 130%. I'm not actually sure if their cutoff is right
So it's
at 130,
below.
but it's below.
Who does all this checking, the local school or?
So,
the
yeah, so the
agency, or?
schools are the ones who are the determining officials, who are determining whether or not a child is eligible for free and reduced price meals. But the agency has an oversight role. And so I mentioned we did a bunch of work this summer to implement universal meals. Our oversight role is that for schools participating in the community eligibility provision, we have to look at a sample of all their directly certified students and make sure that they actually correctly directly certified those students. We did that over the summer months. The other thing that we need to do is schools can participate in the community eligibility provision based on either their own status as a building, or we can combine them with other buildings in that school food authority, which in Vermont is the supervisory union. And if the average of those buildings is, if more than 40% of the students are directly certified for free meals in all those buildings, then all of those buildings can participate in the community eligibility provision, even if a single building there would not have met that cutoff. So we spent a lot of time this summer kind of mixing and matching to figure out which schools within school food authorities should be grouped together in order to maximize the number of schools participating in CEP. So we got to 91 schools, which is more schools than previously have been participating in CEP. And then the remainder, 221, are participating in Provision 2. So the agency's oversight role for Provision 2 is that we have to look at both the direct certification and the free and reduced meal applications for those schools that are in their first year of Provision 2 to again make sure that they've done it correctly, because in the subsequent years, all their claiming percentages are going to be based on that base year. And that work has been more intensive than we expected. It's been time consuming for the schools to get us that information. And my team is still finishing up. We've been working on it all fall, and we're still finishing up a few of those reviews and struggling with a few schools to get information from them, I'm sure, because they're very busy, but that's held that up. So, but we did all the CEP work. We're in process on the Provision 2 work. Schools are serving meals at no charge. We've provided guidance over the summer months on how to do this. And the agency also did a big fill the form campaign this fall, really pushing households to return free and reduced meal applications if those were what was requested for the Provision 2 schools, or the household income form for those schools participating in CEP.
Now, do you have to do that each year, or is this one of the ones that will go for 4 years?
Yeah, so CEP and Provision 2 both have these cycles. So for Provision 2, you know, I mentioned it's a 4-year cycle. So in subsequent years, we don't need to collect applications for the school meals programs. But schools do still need individual student poverty data as a metric of student poverty for all their other educational programs. And so one of the ways of collecting that data, because we can't collect the free and reduced meal application at that time for those schools, is to collect a household income form. So that work, if we need individual student poverty data, has to continue on each year. If that's the metric that we're going to use.
Yeah.
And the agency has been doing a lot of work over the last few years to figure out, you know, is this the correct metric to use? Is there an alternative available? And Anne can speak more to that if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah.
Let's see, we've done that work. Schools are offering meals at no charge. We have participation and claims data for the first 2 months of the school year up until the end of October. Schools have 60 days from the month end to submit that those claims information, or that claims information to us. So we don't yet have information for the later months, and we'll be watching that really closely. Based on that information for the first couple months of the school year, we are seeing an increase in participation. For lunch, this is in the report, but we've gone from about 50% of students participating daily to about 60% of students participating daily as of October. So definitely an increase in participation.
So it's only 10, I don't know where, but I read 16% somewhere.
You probably heard that from somebody who talked to me. I was looking at some initial data for September and kind of analyzing that and came up with 16, but now we've got better data.
It's leveled out.
Yeah, well, not just that it's leveled out, it's more solid data. That was kind of some preliminary stuff missing a couple of schools.
So get this right. So we have 60% participation with 100% everybody covered.
Meals are free to all students,
Yeah.
and on each day, about 60% of students are eating.
Okay.
And we think that
And that's up from 50.
that's up from 50. So participation is one of the big factors in terms of how much universal meals will cost.
Yeah.
JFO had done a range of estimates based on, a lower level of participation or kind of staying at the same level as previously, all the way up to 100% participation. And we knew the true number was going to fall somewhere in there, but we weren't sure. I want to caution you that I don't think September is necessarily, it's not going to stay at 60. There's a couple of factors that we think could be suppressing participation right now. And I can go through those for you. One is that in these Provision 2 schools, where they're having to count the actual students who are eating this year, the names of the students who are eating, rather than just, okay, that's a reimbursable meal, that's a reimbursable meal. That takes more time to count that. And that is just a base year problem, first year Provision 2. In those schools, the students, as they go through the line, they have to enter either a PIN number or swipe a card, or somebody has to check their name off a paper roster, or type their name into a computer system, because we need to record this actual student is eating, because then somebody back in the office needs to figure out, okay, this student is a free eligible student, or this student is a paid eligible student, and that's what makes up the claim that goes to the state. Versus in prior years when we were doing, the last couple of years when we were doing universal meals under the USDA waivers, it was just counting, meal. And so that's taking more time to go through the line. So the lines are longer because participation is up, and it takes each student more time to go through the line. Some schools have responded to that by moving school food service staff from the serving line or from the kitchen where they're preparing meals or serving meals to the point of sale. And so that's an attempt to make those lines shorter. But that, of course, impacts the offerings available. So we've heard from a couple of schools that they've had to eliminate, the make your own sandwich bar, which is really, there's a staff person there who's helping you make the sandwich, or eliminate some of their scratch cooking culinary options, some entrees and that sort of thing. So there's fewer offerings. So that could be decreasing participation for sure. And we have heard in some schools, kids complaining about, we really liked this option and we can't have it anymore. In the other way that may be decreasing participation is that a typical school in Vermont has a lunch period of 20 to 25 minutes. And that includes the amount of time it takes to stand in line to get your meal. So if you have other options, which might be bringing a meal from home or just choosing not to eat, you might use those options rather than spend time in line, because you might want to, obviously you might want to get to the table to eat quicker. You might want to spend that time socializing, going to recess. So that could really be decreasing participation among students who have other
Schools
options.
don't have, students don't have ID cards with their name on. So.
For swiping,
Well, if every student had an ID
Mhm.
card.
many
that's
schools
all
do.
they'd have
Yep.
to do is
Yeah.
at the end of the counter, put your card in, pull it out, and then you're checked through.
So many schools do, and many schools are using that kind of a system, but that still just takes just a little bit more time than, just checking off like tally marks, which is basically what they were doing previously.
So breakfast versus lunch. How many kids participate in breakfast
Yeah, I have those numbers in the
versus
report.
lunch?
and let
Is
me-
there a
There is a
difference?
difference.
And why?
So breakfast is a little bit lower, although we still saw increases in participation. I want to give you the actual numbers, so I'm just going to pull the report up for you. Sorry, it's taking a minute. So we have definitely seen increases in participation in breakfast participation this year, but it is lower than lunch. Obviously a lot of kids do get lunch at home, or, sorry, breakfast at home, and so they may not be taking an additional breakfast at school. So that probably explains most of it. Schools have done interesting things about offering meals in the classroom, so that it's definitely available for any kid who needs it. Breakfast after the bell, grab and go breakfast, having like bag breakfast, like I was saying, that can be taken to the classroom, but it is lower. And I assume that that's because some of those kids are getting that meal at home. Let me pull up the participation for you. So for breakfast, prior to COVID, we had a participation rate of 28.56%, and as of October 2022, it was 38.63%.
It's great.
So it's down 10%,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so is.
And so is lunch, yeah.
Okay.
That was one big factor that we think might be suppressing participation at those Provision 2 schools. When schools are pulling workers off the line, we mentioned that might be impacting meal quality. In addition, there are just big staffing shortages right now in the school meals programs. And I'm hearing from lots of directors who are having to substitute in the kitchens. These are the folks who normally would be doing the menu planning, the training, the ordering. And so they're not as able to spend as much time doing that. And so we don't have any hard data on this, but it feels like meal quality might be a little bit lower this year because of those staffing pressures. In addition,
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't hire people, right?
Yeah. Those programs are also facing supply chain issues still. And that has meant a lot of weird substitutions. And so we do see, parents complaining or kids complaining that they served this item with this other item and that didn't really make any sense. And usually that's because of a substitution. So that meal quality is just still being impacted. So those things could be reducing participation for sure, among kids who have other options. And then the last thing is probably attendance. We don't have attendance data yet for this school year, but there were lots of respiratory diseases, including COVID, circulating this fall. And, anecdotally, we certainly heard about a lot more absences than usual because of illness. And
But
so
your numbers are up though from 10% in both categories.
Right. So what I'm saying is that we expect that those numbers could increase further. We don't want you to do cost estimates, for the next 5 years, assuming a 60% participation rate. You could see, after this base year of Provision 2 passes and we're back to having faster lines, if schools are able to resolve some of these meal quality issues, we could see participation increase further. So we'll be keeping a real close eye on what happens, in the November and December claims to see it increased even from September to October. So we want to see if, is that a trend or,
Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Rosie, I guess I'm still trying to grapple with the numbers here. The plan was to use the federal money to provide breakfast and lunch for all students. If only 30% of those students are taking advantage of, I think you said breakfast, how did that affect? In other words, we put money aside that said, okay, if 100% of the students eat breakfast and 100% of the students eat lunch, it'll cost this amount of money.
Yeah.
Since only 30% are taking advantage of our offer, how did that affect what we're spending?
So there was a range that JOFO presented to you, and the bottom end of the range was no change to participation and no change to the parents or the households returning the free and reduced meal application forms. And I'm going to talk about that one in a second because that's another factor that we have data on now. And the top end of the range was everybody participating and nobody returning free and reduced meal applications. That top end was around $39 million. You all appropriated 29 million, kind of guessing that we'd fall somewhere in the middle of the range.
Okay.
So there's not tens of millions of dollars on the table. The other piece of data we have at this point is we have the percent of households who return free and reduced meal applications. Prior to COVID, about 38% of Vermont of students qualified for free and reduced price meals. And that was partially households who qualified via direct certification, and then partially households who qualified via applications. We weren't sure, there's no incentive for households to return applications when meals are free. So we weren't sure how that would be impacted. We did do a big campaign to try and get households to do that. That was supported by Hunger Free Vermont. And we found that there definitely was a decline in households returning applications, but about 3,000 families did continue to return applications, or 3,000 students continued to qualify via application. So that brought our free and reduced percentage statewide down to around 34%. And the exact numbers are in the report for you. So there was definitely a decline from pre-COVID when we were charging for meals, but we did still have some students qualifying via application. And then of course, all of those students who qualified via direct certification, that wasn't impacted at all. They continued to qualify that way. So we can take those numbers and say that around 65% of students don't qualify for free and reduced price meals. And we can apply that this year and say that if students ate according to, like in direct proportion to the eligibility. So if we don't have more paid students eating proportionally to free and reduced price students, we can apply that to our participation rates as of October. And if participation doesn't change, we'd be spending something like $27 million to fund the state portion of universal meals. And the exact math is in that report for you. So we're going to keep watching that really closely because obviously participation could increase and there could potentially be, students not eating exactly in proportion to their categories. We would expect to see more free and reduced eligible students eating than paid students. And so hopefully that will play out and that won't impact the price and increase the cost. But we're going to be watching that number really closely, and we'll let you know should it exceed or look like it's on track to exceed that appropriated amount.
So are the school districts, are you working with the supervisory unions or individual town schools? Is it both?
We work with the supervisory union level.
So if there was some way to reward them or punish them for not doing.
So yeah, we really are limited by the federal programs. The requirement is that the meal application is voluntary. So we've really tried to support the districts in collecting those applications, and our Fill the Form campaign gave them language to send out to households, posters, social media, and Hunger Free Vermont supported a lot of that work with doing some marketing directly to households as well. But we can't require that households submit the free and reduced meal application. That's not allowed. So
to follow up, so if we had everybody participate, breakfast and lunch, that's 39 in average.
everybody participating and no households returning applications.
Okay.
So those are the two factors.
But the top level is 39 million. So, but we have, what we know of, 60% of the people participating in lunch. We have someplace just under 40% doing breakfast. So even with the 29 that we had, because if in my brain, the 29 is probably about 75% participation across the state would eat that up. We're gonna have money left over from that number.
Of the 20, we appropriated.
You appropriated
28 or
29.
29.
Yeah, there
So
should be
that's
money.
70, so there should be money left over from that. And what we're looking at, if the numbers hold true, even if we were at the 60% level across all of it, that's about 23 million.
I'm not sure I follow where the 23 million is coming from.
If we're at the 60% level and 60% of everybody did breakfast and lunch.
So if we had current participation, 60% of breakfast, 60% participating in lunch and 38% participating.
Well,
in breakfast.
I just, we'll bump the breakfast up.
When I did the math to get to 27 million, that was based on those October participation rates and based on the free and reduced meal application return rate, the free and reduced percentage that we have this fall. And so that gets us to about.
My question is, how do you get to the 27?
Yeah. So the other factor that changed this year was the free and reduced reimbursement, the free, reduced, and paid reimbursements from the federal government. Those increased as of July 1st. So last year, when all that math was done, that was based on that the difference between the paid reimbursement rate and the free reimbursement rate for lunch was $3.18. And this year, because those numbers updated as of July 1st at the federal level, that difference was $3.56. So when you take that change as well, you apply those new, it's a new per meal cost for the state. We're calling it the Universal Meal Supplement.
Mhm.
When you take that and you multiply that, you take the overall number of students who are enrolled in school meals programs, so it's about 84,000 students, multiply that by the 60% participation rate, and that for lunch, and the 38 participation rate for breakfast. And then you multiply that by 65% of those students would qualify for paid meals.
Mhm.
And then you multiply that by 318 356 for the universal meal
Instead
supplement.
of the lower.
Instead of the lower one.
Yeah.
And then you do the same thing for breakfast, except use the breakfast participation rate and you use the breakfast per meal reimbursement, which I want to say is $1.57, but it's in the report and I can pull it up. That's what gets you to about $27 million.
Yeah.
Oh, and times 175 schools.
I hear what you're doing. I still can't get to the 27 in my head. I probably need to see it on
Yeah,
a piece
we
of
can-
paper. Yeah, and
I don't
that,
remember. I don't think I put it in a footnote in the report, but I can certainly do
because,
it out.
because I'm going, if the all-in is 40
Yeah.
million,
Yeah. So that all in of 40 million assumed that prior year reimbursement. And
it
so-
assumed the lower reimbursement, and we're benefiting from a higher reimbursement from the feds. So,
No, we're not. It's costing us more money.
oh, it's cost, okay.
Yeah.
That's why I need to
yes.
see it.
The other issue on the school lunch program, in most schools, if you have a librarian, you have a librarian and a librarian, the salary of the librarian goes into the school budget. If you have an athletic program and you have coaches, the coaches' pay goes into the school budget. But for some reason, we have a hot lunch program, the salaries of those hot lunch people come out of the cost of the lunch program, it doesn't go to the general fund of the school budget. And if we wanted to bring the overall costs down of what children are actually eating, school districts could, because they're gonna offer insurance programs and retirement programs and all these good things to the hot lunch staff. And the kids are gonna be paying the bill or Montpelier is. And if the school district wants to offer these pennies to their staff, well, maybe they should get some skin in the game and move those people to the general fund rather than having the children pay.
So I can speak to that a little bit. The school meals programs are an enterprise account. And so they're all the income that comes in from the reimbursements or from any paid meals, a la carte sales, sales to teachers, whatever. All of that goes into the enterprise account. And it's generally expected that that account breaks even. It can't make a profit, but that it would break even. It often doesn't, in which case it has to be made whole by the general fund. So school meal programs are trying to, budget according to the reimbursements that they're making and make it break even so that they don't have to contribute from the general fund. We did a survey this year as part of the financial report that schools submit to us to find out average salary for the school food service director, what the hourly rate was for the lowest paid school food service employee, and what benefits are offered, if any. So we do have that data.
We do have that.
And that's, that could be certainly something that's contributing to the workforce shortage in these programs. The
They have
average.
the highest paid people in this town.
No.
No.
So the average starting hourly wage, when I say that the median, the most common, was $15 an hour. And the average was closer to $16 an hour. But there were a couple of school districts where that hourly wage was low enough as of June of this past year that they were going to need to increase it in order to meet the state's minimum wage requirements this year. When you compare that to, what folks can make working in a fast food restaurant, that's similar wages or lower, and it's certainly a challenging job. It would be reasonable to expect that might be causing some of the difficulties in hiring.
Yeah, I think the staff would get used better if they were paid through the general fund as a non-certified employee. The bus drivers and custodians and all those people, most school districts have to pay them pretty well to get them to come to work. And, but anyway, it's just my thinking to get the cost of the meals down where, it is covering the cost of the meal. Would be less money, but just something to think about.
What else would you all like to know about how University Meals is going this year? There's a bunch of stuff in the report.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that, so the local foods incentive grant.
Mhm.
So it looks like the summary says a total of roughly 775,000 was put into the local economy due to food purchasing. So that, on the surface, that seems like a good number, but I don't
know what you're comparing it to.
neither, I have nothing to compare it to. So that's why I'm looking, is it, do you think this will grow? Our hope, of course, is to, gosh, it would be incredible. We heard yesterday from Farm to Plate folks. That's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that seems to me like a good number, but yesterday we talked about how Farm to Plate 10 years ago, all this stuff was just starting and now it's huge. Be exciting to see this, which I think is our hope. So this is just starting and 10 years, it could be huge. I mean, Vermont could be the state where
Yeah.
food goes from farms right to kids. So I'm just trying to get a sense of, your impressions on whether or not there's anything we need to do to kind of get this to grow faster and better and help our farmers with, that predictability.
Yeah, so the way that the local foods incentive is structured is that there are two levels of grant. There's the base year grant, which is a set of fairly easy requirements for schools to meet. They're eligible for that grant one year. And so this is the second year of the grant. So we have a bunch of folks who've received that already and moved on to the subsequent year grants. And the subsequent year grants are much more difficult to receive, and that's really attempting to change behavior.
Okay.
And so in the subsequent year grants, you have to actually prove that you have purchased at least 15% of your food locally to get the 15 cents per plate incentive.
Which I have to say, that's a lot. If you're buying 15% locally, that's a really good start. I mean, that's a chunk of food.
So we saw, in the first year, lots of schools applying for the base year. This year, all of those schools are then eligible to apply for the subsequent year. A smaller number did. I want to say it's 8, but it is in the report.
Okay.
Actually, and these are school food authorities, not individual school buildings, actually applied, and I want to say 6 of them qualified. So there were several that applied that didn't actually qualify. We have yet to audit those ones who said that they reported to us that they met the threshold. So it's possible that some of those folks will be kicked out of the program when we do the audit. We hope not.
I hope not too. Even if they got kind of close. Right?
Yeah, well, we can't.
I know.
Close is not enough.
I know. Okay. But they're working hard for it.
So yes.
Yeah.
And we would expect that in fact, we did hear from a couple of those folks who attempted to qualify this year and didn't, that they plan to keep trying next
But
year.
I think there's some products that are not eligible to
Yeah, so
to
you all.
get into the 15%.
You all made some decisions about what you wanted to qualify, and so you specifically excluded milk. So milk does not count towards the local purchasing incentive. And that was a
And that's
decision
a
that you
big
all
item.
came to.
So 15% then is meat and veggies and fruit
And bread products.
and bread products. Okay.
Milk should have been in.
Yeah, well, that was Brian. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just sitting here trying to think. Did you have an idea ahead of time, Rosie, like projection about how many students would take advantage of both breakfast and lunch? In other words, you knew at one point that we were at whatever percent it was at 50, and then we went to 60 with the lunch. And the reason I ask is at some point, the people in the kitchen must have had to know how much food to prepare. If there's 100% of the kids coming through, we need a whole lot of food. And if they didn't, then obviously it's not a good idea to run out of food either. So how did that work? And if they made more than they gave out, where did all that extra food wind up?
So that's always a tricky thing for the food service programs to figure out. You never know from day to day, and different entrees are more popular than others.
Yeah.
And so you're always trying to figure it out. The 60% is somewhat in line with some limited data that there is available from schools that had previously been offering universal meals prior to COVID. So that's where some of those initial cost estimates, why we were kind of comfortable with some of those ideas about, we'll pick a number in the middle. So that kind of comes from, or we could have expected that based on some of that earlier data. But the schools really, the first few days, they're kind of shooting high, and they have some backup plans in terms of what will they serve if they're running out. And,
For the next day.
you try to serve a variety of things. You've got some options. And some schools do ask for pre-orders. Obviously if a student shows up without a meal, they'd find something for them, but that pre-ordering allows them to kind of guess. But yeah, it's a tough part of the job to figure out what they're going to do. And then they're pretty adept at using leftovers in the programs. So, you know, if you're serving lasagna one day, you may serve those additional servings of lasagna the next day as an additional option on the, you know, for the entree. The kids can choose between the chicken sandwich and the lasagna on the second day, that sort of
I
thing.
didn't know if food shelves made out better because
The programs are allowed to donate to a nonprofit organization, 501c3 nonprofit, if they have excess food. And some do that. They're not, I wouldn't say that that's made that there's been a huge change in that this year, because they've always had to plan and
Yeah.
guess.
All
You know, if there's a lot of sickness or a special event happening where, you know, the sixth grade class is gone, that's going to impact your numbers. There's always stuff like that going on.
So it sounds like the numbers are up. The cost is down, or so far we have.
I think you'll be okay on the cost. I think that's the message that I want you to take is you didn't under appropriate. I wouldn't expect, like, I don't start planning to spend the difference between the 29 and 27 million. We want to see how participation is going to go.
For dessert.
We want to get some more data for the next few months and see how it's going. Certainly if things turn around and participation shoots up, then we may be in a position where we would need additional funds. So we just want to keep a close eye on it. I do want to give you some information about going forward, some things that could impact the cost for universal meals if you choose to extend it.
Or would it lower it or raise it?
It's good news.
Depends on which
yeah.
way, whether we want to hear it.
So Vermont has been approved to participate in the Medicaid direct certification pilot starting in July of this year. And that pilot is a USDA pilot that will allow us to directly certify students for both free meals and reduced price meals, depending on whether their households, or if their families participate in Medicaid and fall into those income thresholds in Medicaid. So we've been working with the Department of Vermont Health Access to apply for that pilot and figure out how we're going to get that data and send it to schools. We haven't started doing actual matches yet. So this is very preliminary, but based on the number of students ages 5 to 18 that they have in those ranges, in those households under 130% and under 185%, we think we may be able to basically replace all of those students who used to apply via applications. And so that we may end up with back at a statewide free and reduced percentage around 38%. And all those students would be directly certified for free meal or for free or reduced price meals. And the ones who are directly certified for for free meals, those would count for CEP. So those would increase, we talked about the direct certification percentage multiplied by 1.6, and that's what gets you to the percent of meals that you can qualify.
So
Yeah.
you're asking Eva to do what already exists. Is there, for example, because Diva does eligibility, so for example, Dr. Dinosaur, which goes up to 300% of poverty. Do they have the ability to go to, in an easy way, if you could make it work for the lower percentage, could they make it work for a higher percentage?
They have the ability to pull out 100, like to pull out who is under 130 and who is under 185. And that's what's allowing us to do this pilot. If we didn't have that data.
So if they're already doing that eligibility though, for say like Dr. Dinosaur, which is 300%, you think they could do that?
I can't speak for Diva. So it sounds reasonable to me, but I can't speak for what their capability is.
But that could generate more money from the feds and less money from us if they.
Yeah, so that's the exciting thing is that, you know, previously we had about 18,000 students in the state who were directly certified for free meals using those other sources. put the numbers in the report, but I want to say that it was 24,000. We should go back and look at the report for sure, but it's a significantly higher number of students who would be directly certified for free meals specifically. And then we take that and multiply it by 1.6. And all of those meals get reimbursed at the free reimbursement rate by the feds, meaning that the state would not need to pay the universal meal supplement for those meals. In addition, USDA has just given notice that they're going to be issuing a proposed rule in July of this year that would presumably go into effect in school year 24-25, that would lower the threshold for participating in CEP from 40% of your students being directly certified to some lower number. And we don't know what that number will be until we see the proposed rule. But that is something that USDA actually has authority to do. And that will make potentially more of our schools eligible for CEP. And we might be able to draw down more federal funds that way.
So did you say 16% to 24%?
No, let me
Or
get back in the
18.
report and give you actual numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head. I know it's 18,000 Vermont students were previously directly
18,000.
certified. Oops.
While she's doing it, I'm just trying to think of, the young farmer that was here from East Montpelier, he's got this great website, you can buy all sorts of things. I don't know if you're the school, it'd be great to just get on and buy or pick it up. There's certain things that he could supply, it looks like that. So how do you help them all kind of make that connection? Because I think just watching what happened with Farm to Plate, I think that could happen in our schools easily.
I can speak to that in a second. So we estimate with DEVA's preliminary numbers that about 28,000 students would be directly certified for free meals once we have.
28.
Yeah. So it's going from 18,000 to 28,000 would really
Oh,
increase.
That's huge.
That's huge,
That's
yeah,
huge.
that's a 50%,
That's huge.
more than
Yeah.
50% increase.
And again, we haven't started doing the actual matches yet,
But,
but this is very preliminary data showing that this is really promising.
That's
So
great.
And what's the allowable amount for the feds to pay, or what do they pay? The 450 or?
So they would pay the full free reimbursement rate. Let me pull those
See,
numbers up for you.
Wow.
Seems like the full reimbursement rate is more than the full pay student pays. I'm not sure, but it seems like I remember that from my school board days. If you have a free student,
Yeah.
totally free,
Yeah.
you get more money from that particular lunch than you do from Johnny that has to pay his full.
You're not supposed to. So there are those federal rules that require that those free and reduced meals don't subsidize. Whoops, sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once here while I talk to you.
But didn't you say at the beginning of this that the students that are paying are not always paying the full price?
When we're talking about reduced price students?
Well, when you started your conversation here today,
Mhm.
the students that pay full boat, they, I thought you said,
Oh, the federal government does subsidize those meals.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. So let me give you the reimbursement rates for this
That would-
year.
built right into what you said.
Yeah.
The free meal this year, the reimbursement rate is $4.41. And the paid reimbursement rate this year is higher than I told you, it's 85 cents. So then it's the difference between those two that gets you what the universal meal supplement is that the state is paying.
441 versus 431.
441 versus 85 cents. So the difference between those two this year is $3.56.
And that's what the feds are paying,
No, that's what the state is paying.
states.
So,
So it's very important to collect that federal money.
As much as you can get.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're still paying the bill, the taxpayers I guess, and maybe they'll add it to those trillions that they're gonna raise the debt. So nobody's paying, we're just paying the interest.
Right.
So Senator Campion, you were mentioning, getting more local purchasing. And one of, that was obviously the goal of the local foods incentive, and foods purchases from that farmer would count towards this. But one of the big hurdles for schools is that because these are federally funded programs, they have to follow federal procurement requirements. So it's not just a matter of, I know
right.
about this farmer, I'm gonna
Right.
buy from them. You actually have to check prices in multiple places. And so that additional paperwork
Yeah,
can sometimes be prohibitive. And we've done a lot of training to try and help
Yeah.
schools with that. There are organizations out there that try to help schools with that and try to make it easier. And a lot, the various farm school organizations have really, that's where they're focused, is not just making those connections, but making sure that it is easy to procure that food.
would it make sense for this, I don't know, should there be a sort of a designated person just to help with that kind of stuff? I mean, it might sound silly, but gosh, it's just, I get it. People are so pressured and I just think it's such a win-win when you get kids, eating local. You look at, I'm guessing health rates are better, diets, weights down, all these things are reduced. So I don't know if that's sort of a preventative thing that, the state had somebody that just worked on this. I don't know.
So as part of the bill that created the local foods incentive, you gave child nutrition programs an additional position.
Okay.
That person is responsible for running the local foods incentive grant program.
Yep.
Provide some technical
Some
assistance,
support.
doesn't do the procurement for them,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
Like that would be,
But they've got somebody on the other line.
but they're there. And then the Agency of Agriculture does also have somebody who works on farm to school programs.
Okay.
As well. So there is some support at the state level, maybe not as much as you're envisioning. And there are creative ideas about could the state procure the product or that sort of thing, but that's difficult because trying to do that on a statewide level, you're potentially missing out on the little folks.
What I sort of had in mind that we've started talking about is farmers taking their veggies to the food hubs. And then the school lunch program would have it delivered through the food hubs to the different schools on a regular basis. And I should think that being able to buy it that way would be a lot different than buying it directly, the hot lunch business person buying it from farmer A or farmer B or C.
Mhm.
They would call the food hub.
Yeah.
Or the food hub would call them how many, carrots or how much lettuce or whatever do you need. Somebody would take it, whoever takes care of the ordering would make a phone call to the food hub.
And that's something that does happen in some areas. So Food Connects in Southern Vermont, they operate basically a vending program where the schools can go in and purchase from them. And then they aggregate from a number of farms. And Green Mountain Green Mountain Farm School is doing a similar thing as well, and in Northern Vermont. But again, those are considered to be one vendor. And so they have to competitively procure and make sure that it's not, well, they have to check prices in multiple places and that sort of thing. It's can be done for sure. It's some amount of additional work. And so when you're talking about programs where that director this year, instead of doing that procurement work, is subbing in the kitchen or on the line, that work can't
hard.
happen when they're doing that.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the challenges. But certainly those folks who did get that second year local foods incentive grant this year, those folks are doing that. They're going out of their way to make sure that they can purchase local foods in order to hit that incentive.
So on an overall basis, how do you feel the program went? you know, has it been working poorly, well, what might be some other things? I mean, you told us some things that we need to pay attention to and maybe address, but how's it gone in your mind overall?
Universal meals or local foods,
Yeah.
universal meals. So the feedback from the schools and from households has been overwhelmingly positive. You know, folks are really happy to have this option. And in talking to my colleagues in other states, so there are a handful of other states that have done this along with Vermont and are also providing universal meals this year. And then the remaining states have gone back to charging for meals. And they're reporting some extreme challenges in getting households to return applications or to pay bills. So, you know, it's great that we're not in that situation this year and having those difficulties. It was more challenging than I expected to do the Provision 2 base year audits. That took us a longer time than expected. And one concern I have next year is that if we have all these great new Medicaid direct cert numbers, we're going to want all our schools to start new base years of Provision 2 or new CEP cycles in order to take advantage of those numbers. And so that's going to be an increased need of staff on my team next fall to do that. And then in summer of 2024 to do the new CEP base years. And doing that will allow us to draw down more federal funding, but it's a lot of additional work on my team. And this year we have had to push off a bunch of our federally required administrative reviews to next year in order to get all of that work done. So we got a waiver from USDA to allow us to do that, but at some point we can't, you know, it'll have been a long time since, yeah. So I am concerned about that and just trying to balance all that work.
But if we go to that from 18 to 20, what,
28.
28,000, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of money, I would think. So there should be, well, there'd be more work involved. So of course you need a little more labor involved to manage it, so.
So that's one concern I've got for next year. I think the biggest complaints I heard were from independent schools. And the way that you handled independent schools in Act 151 is that you provided funding for, if they were state approved independent school, and I should say independent schools are allowed to participate in the National School Lunch Program as long as they're either state approved or state recognized and are not for profit.
Yeah.
So we do have about 20 independent schools that do participate in the programs generally. Some of those were, you know, serving high need students prior to COVID and have, you know, long been doing CEP. But then some of those are like, you know, the academies and those sorts of schools.
Yeah.
So the way that you set up funding for independent schools was that if the school was state approved and they offered universal meals to all of their students, the state pays the universal meals supplement for the publicly funded students attending that school. So that required some changes to our claiming system in order to be able to make that all work. So we spent about $18,000, not just for the independent school side of things, but to make the universal meal supplement work in our online claiming system. And so those independent schools, when they report their claim each month to us, they report the number of publicly funded students, the number of meals eaten by those students, and then the number of non-publicly funded students. They get the federal funds for the non-publicly funded students, but then they only get the state universal meal supplement for the publicly funded students. Those schools, we heard some complaints from independent schools that did not have a lot of publicly funded students, just feeling that it was not fair. And we also heard some concerns from schools that were not state approved, that are state recognized, feeling concerned that they weren't eligible for those funds. I also had a kind of a logistical question, which is when we're doing CEP for the subsequent years of Provision 2, we're not actually claiming meals based on the actual student who ate, it's all percentage. And so we couldn't figure out, is this particular student publicly funded or not, and should they get reimbursement for that? So what we came up with, and I'd love some legislative direction about whether this is an appropriate, whether this is how you'd like us to handle this going forward, is we had those schools who were in that situation report the number of publicly funded students compared to their total enrollment, and we used that to calculate a percentage, and then we applied that percentage to their paid student percentage. And that's how we figured out how much to fund them. It seems like a good solution, but it wasn't, exactly what you asked us to do in terms of funding exactly those meals, because there's just no way to figure out exactly who is eating those meals.
Sounds like a pretty fair way of doing it in a quick way. I mean,
I think the education committee will probably.
Yeah, we can dig into it a little bit if you want also,
yeah,
Good.
So yeah, those were some general thoughts about how you might consider that going forward. And then just to keep in mind for your cost estimates going forward, that USDA updates those meal reimbursement rates every July. And one of the reasons that state funding is costing so much this year is because we didn't expect the reimbursement rate to be as high, and the difference between those two reimbursement rates to be as high. We based the estimates on last year's reimbursement rates. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're appropriating, knowing that number, that per meal reimbursement is likely to grow every year. And just to keep that in mind. The way you've structured it, it allows for the funding to be paid out, but you just wouldn't want to make an estimate based on assuming that will never grow.
well, other questions for Rosie?
Thank you. Thanks for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great
I
work.
think It was very, very informative. And, so I guess you got some work ahead. Yeah.
I will say, to repeat, it would be helpful if I got some of these numbers down.
Sure, yeah,
on paper
I'm happy to write those up for
be
you.
able to-
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I'd love to
obviously,
see
that's my math, and you definitely want to bring JFO in and ask them to
Yeah,
to check it.
But,
But I'm happy to.
but
provide
you're
that to you.
dealing with it every day.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so if there are no further questions,
That's great.
thank you very much.